Chapter 1. The Glass Room at Greystone Hall. The rain fell in soft sheets across the Yorkshire moors, veiling the great manor of Greystone Hall in a misty shroud. From a distance, the grand estate looked like a phantom ship, adrift in a grey sea. Up close, it was a picture of refinement. Stone buttresses, gargoyles carved in the likeness of long-forgotten ancestors, and to the rear, a magnificent conservatory of glass and iron, stretching from the house like a crystal wing. It was in this very conservatory, on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, that the first whispers of tragedy took root. Hercule Poirot arrived at Greystone Hall at the personal request of Lady Margaret Derwent, a woman of considerable breeding and a reputation for maintaining propriety even in the face of disaster. She greeted him at the great front doors, her figure tall and statuesque in a dove-grey gown, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with a tight smile, "I thank you for coming on such short notice. I fear something is terribly wrong." Poirot inclined his head with grave politeness. "You spoke of an incident involving the conservatory." "Yes," she replied, turning to lead him inside. "It has been sealed since last night, locked from the inside, and no one has seen my husband since yesterday afternoon." "Lord Alistair Derwent?" Poirot asked, though he already knew the answer. She gave a single nod. "I fear he is still inside." They moved through the house in silence, Poirot's sharp eyes noting every detail: the impeccable arrangements, the faint scent of old cigars, and the closed doors that seemed to hum with tension. When they reached the conservatory, two uniformed constables stood guard at either end of the hall, their expressions taut. The glass doors to the conservatory were locked, not just locked, but bolted with a heavy brass mechanism from within. The key was missing. Poirot placed a hand on the pane. It was cold. Rainwater trickled down the outside, blurring the view into the lush greenery beyond. Inside, he could make out tall ferns, exotic orchids, and something else. A shadow slumped in a wicker chair, unmoving. "Has anyone tried breaking the glass?" he asked. Lady Margaret shook her head. "I wouldn't allow it. Not until you arrived. The entire room is hermetically sealed. My husband insisted on it, for the sake of the plants. Controlled temperature, filtered air. The only door is this one, and the windows don't open." "Curious," Poirot murmured. "And the servants? No one saw him enter?" "None. He dined early, then went out for his customary stroll. We assumed he returned later, but when I found the conservatory locked this morning, I grew concerned." Poirot nodded once and motioned to the constables. "Break the side panel, gently." With a nod, one officer stepped forward with a small crowbar, and with a single sharp crack, shattered the lower corner of the pane. Poirot stepped through, carefully, avoiding the glass. The air inside the conservatory was thick with moisture and a heady mix of floral scents. The warmth was immediate, stifling. The floor beneath his feet was tiled in a mosaic of greens and browns, echoing the jungle that grew within. He moved slowly, purposefully, until he reached the central seating area. There, Lord Alistair Derwent sat slumped in a rattan chair, a half-finished glass of brandy at his side. His eyes were open, wide with a frozen expression of alarm. He was quite dead. Poirot knelt and examined the body. No wound, no blood, No sign of a struggle. The glass of brandy was intact, its contents undisturbed. Lady Margaret, watching from the broken panel, let out a faint gasp and covered her mouth with a handkerchief. Poirot stirred and surveyed the space again. Every plant was meticulously labeled, the benches swept clean, the irrigation system humming gently in the background. There was no chaos, no sign of forced entry or exit. Just the body of a man in a room, sealed tight from the inside. Poirot turned, slowly, his expression unreadable. "There is more here than meets the eye," he said softly. Later that day, the coroner arrived and confirmed what Poirot suspected. No visible injuries, no signs of poisoning from the brandy, and no cause of death that could be immediately determined. The sealed room posed a greater mystery still. "It is the classic puzzle, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot said to himself that evening, as he sat in the guest quarters assigned to him. The locked room mystery. But in this case, the room is made of glass, and all is visible, and yet still, the truth hides. He took out his small notebook and wrote 3 names. Lady Margaret Derwent, devoted wife, poised, guarded Edward Linley. The secretary, discreet, soft-spoken Dr. Hugo Ransom. The botanist, curious about more than just plants. Below those names, he drew a square, and inside it, a single word. Conservatory. He tapped his pen against his chin. Somewhere inside that word, inside that sealed room, lay the answer. Not just how Lord Alistair died, but why. And Poirot would find it. Chapter 2. The Botanist's Secret. The morning after Lord Alistair Derwent's body was discovered, the skies over Greystone Hall remained overcast, as though the weather itself shared the estate's troubled mood. Hercule Poirot rose precisely at 7 o'clock, shaved, dressed impeccably, and descended the grand staircase with the serene poise of a man about to begin the careful dissection of a human soul, or several. Breakfast was served in the east drawing room, overlooking the manicured gardens and the sealed conservatory beyond. Lady Margaret sat at the head of the table, dressed in a soft lavender gown, her manner restrained but composed. Edward Linley, the family's secretary, poured himself coffee with trembling hands. Dr. Hugo Ransom, the estate's resident botanist, wore a somewhat crumpled linen suit and buttered his toast absent-mindedly, eyes locked on the window. Poirot entered and bowed courteously. "Good morning, mes amis. I trust you slept as well as the circumstances would allow?" There were murmured greetings. Poirot seated himself, declined the offer of tea, and took a moment to stir his coffee, precisely 3 times clockwise. "I should like, if it pleases you, to speak to each of you today. In private," he said, setting down his spoon. "There are details yet clouded by grief and uncertainty. I intend to clear the mist." Lady Margaret inclined her head with quiet dignity. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever is needed." Poirot's first visit was to the conservatory once more, this time with a full day's light filtering through the glass, casting shifting reflections across the tiled floor. It was not just a garden, he now realized. It was a carefully curated world. Tropical orchids, pitcher plants, heliotropes, each species meticulously labeled and positioned with scientific precision. He was joined there by Dr. Ransom, who approached from the side entrance with his usual distracted energy. You wished to speak with me, Monsieur Poirot? He asked, his fingers fiddling with a small pruneau clipped to his belt. Oui, doctor. This conservatory, it was your domain, no? In many ways, I maintained it for the past 5 years. Lord Alistair spared no expense. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Tell me, this sealing of the conservatory, why such measures? It seems almost paranoid. Ransom gave a small laugh. Alistair was obsessive. Said he wanted to replicate a rainforest environment, stable, untouched. He had sensors installed for humidity, temperature, even air purity. It's more of a greenhouse laboratory than a garden. And the locking mechanism, also his idea. Yes, he had it reinforced last year. Said he feared theft of rare orchids, but in truth, I think it was more about control. He liked things contained. Ah, Poirot said softly. Control, a dangerous thing when taken too far. Ransom shifted uncomfortably. I suppose. He wasn't a cruel man, but difficult, demanding, especially in recent months. Indeed, why so? The botanist hesitated. There was talk of cutting staff, selling off parts of the estate, financial strain perhaps, and he grew more secretive. Would spend hours alone in here, sometimes even overnight. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Overnight, in this room? Yes. He said he slept better surrounded by plants than by people. Interesting, Poirot murmured. Tell me, doctor, were there any plants here that might be dangerous? Ransom paused. You mean poisonous? Poirot gestured delicately. Let us say, lethal. The botanist turned and pointed to a tall, striking plant with deep purple flowers. That is Aconitum napellus, monkshood. A single touch to an open wound can be fatal. Over there, digitalis purpurea, foxglove. And we have Sacus revoluta. Its seeds are extremely toxic. Poirot absorbed this in silence. Would they leave a trace? Perhaps. But subtle, very subtle. Merci, doctor. You have been most helpful. He watched the man depart, his eyes lingering on the pruner, still clipped to his belt. Later that morning, Poirot took his place in the library, an oak-paneled sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and soft lamplight. Lady Margaret arrived promptly, her bearing unchanged. Please, Poirot said, motioning for her to sit. I wish only to understand the late Lord Derwent a little better. His temperament, his habits. She sighed, folding her hands in her lap. Alistair was complicated, generous when it suited him, proud. He loved this estate more than anything. More than you, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps. You mentioned that he went walking every day. Alone? Yes, often to the moor, sometimes for hours. I stopped asking where. Had he made any enemies, to your knowledge? She hesitated. None that I could name. But there were arguments lately, about money, about Edward. The secretary? Yes. Alistair accused him of something, I don't know what, just that it was serious. Did Edward appeared afraid? Very. Poirot made a note in his book. And did your husband ever mention Dr. Ransom? Was there any friction? She shook her head. Only that Alistair found his scientific approach too cold. They disagreed over the direction of the conservatory. Alistair wanted aesthetics. Ransom wanted experiments. Merci, Lady Derwent. You have been most gracious. Edward Linley was lost. The secretary appeared nervous, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief as he entered the study. You were close to Lord Derwent, were you not? Poirot asked gently. I worked for him for 7 years, Linley said. We had professional respect. Yet, I understand he accused you of something. Linley went pale. That's not entirely accurate. There was a misunderstanding, a ledger discrepancy. I explained it. He accepted the explanation, grudgingly. And after that, he kept me on. But he no longer trusted me. I began looking for new positions. Poirot studied him. You were in the house the night of his death? Yes, in my quarters. I never went near the conservatory. Poirot tapped his pen. You must forgive me, Monsieur Linley, but you strike me as a man with many pressures and few allies. Linley swallowed hard. I'm not proud of everything, Monsieur Poirot, but I didn't kill him. I swear it. Poirot leaned back, considering. That afternoon, Poirot took a solitary walk through the gardens, boots crunching against gravel, as the wind carried the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. He returned to the conservatory just as the light was fading and the first hints of dusk touched the glass. The room was unchanged, a shrine of foliage and silence. But Poirot now saw it differently. He examined the floor near Lord Alistair's chair again. A faint trail, barely visible, of disturbed dust, not leading to the door, but toward the eastern vent, a low metallic grate just beneath a bed of orchids. He knelt, using his handkerchief to gently unscrew it. Inside was an empty vial, tucked behind the mesh. Poirot held it up to the fading light, clear, unlabeled, but it smelled faintly of almonds. He stood slowly, a frown settling on his brow. Someone had come prepared, not with violence, but with knowledge, and that, to Hercule Poirot, was far more dangerous. Chapter 3. Whispers Behind Glass. The wind howled through the old chimneys of Greystone Hall that night, making the tall ancestral windows shudder with each gust. Inside, the house held its breath. Servants moved quietly, eyes lowered. The usual clatter of silver and china at dinner was muted, and even the great-grandfather clock in the hall seemed reluctant to mark the hours. Poirot sat alone in the small drawing-room, surrounded by high-backed chairs and portraits of Derwents long since gone to dust. A small fire crackled in the hearth. The sealed conservatory loomed beyond the window, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, still and silent, as though holding its secrets just out of reach. He stared at the small vial he had found behind the vent earlier that day, a scent like bitter almonds. A classic clue, nah. Cyanide, perhaps. But the coroner had found no trace of it in Lord Derwent's bloodstream. So what was it? It was not the poison itself that preoccupied Poirot, but the placement of the vial. Why there? It was no accident. Whoever had left it had gone through trouble to conceal it, but not too well. It was almost theatrical, and Poirot distrusted drama. It too often masked the truth. There was a soft knock at the door. Without waiting for a response, Lady Margaret entered, wrapped in a velvet shawl, the color of winter berries. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Monsieur Poirot. Not at all, madam. Please, sit. Do you wish to speak of your husband? She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her movements graceful, though her face bore the wear of a sleepless night. "In part," she said, "but more so, I wish to speak of the people around him." Poirot's eyebrow arched. Go on. Margaret leaned forward, her voice low. Edward Linley. He is capable, loyal in his way, but frightened. I fear he may do something foolish. Such as, she hesitated, protect someone. Poirot folded his hands. Whom does he protect? I don't know, but there was once an incident. A few months ago, I overheard an argument between Edward and Alistair. It was in the study. Alistair accused him of being in possession of something that didn't belong to him. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And was he? I never discovered what it was, but Edward was shaken. He denied it, but Alistair threatened to involve the police. And did he? No. The matter disappeared, or rather, was buried. Buried things, Poirot said softly, have a way of surfacing. She gave a faint nod, then turned her eyes to the window. I loved Alistair, she said as though remembering. But there were parts of him even I could not reach. The following morning brought with it an unexpected visitor. Inspector Harold McClintock, of the North Riding Constabulary, a wiry man with bristled grey hair, and a way of chewing the inside of his cheek when irritated. He had worked with Poirot once before, and found the experience both enlightening and exhausting. Well, Poirot, he grunted as he entered the conservatory beside him. I hear we've got ourselves a sealed room puzzle. Again? Ah, mon ami, Poirot said with a smile. You say it with such fatigue. And yet it is precisely this type of mystery that keeps the little grey cells in good health. The inspector glanced at the scene. Coroner says no sign of trauma, no poison found, locked from the inside, no forced entry. You found a vial. Poirot handed it to him. Empty, hidden in the vent, with a trace of scent. Almonds. McClintock sniffed it, frowned. Could be cyanide, could be theatrics. Indeed, and the body bore none of the usual signs. I suspect something more elusive. McClintock rubbed his temples. So, what's your theory? Poirot smiled gently. I do not theorize, mon ami. I observe, and observe he did. For the remainder of the day, Poirot questioned staff, reviewed household ledgers, and inspected the entire perimeter of the conservatory. He found a single footprint beneath a window on the outside. A partial heel mark in the soil, too shallow to identify, too suggestive to ignore. That evening, as twilight crept over Greystone Hall once more, Poirot invited Dr. Hugo Ransom back to the conservatory. I ask you to indulge a curiosity, he said as they stepped inside. Ransom adjusted his spectacles. Of course. Poirot led him to a far corner, where a row of delicate bell-shaped flowers bloomed in hues of deep gold. These? Poirot asked. Are they toxic? Ransom shook his head. No. Harmless. Decorative. Why? Poirot made a non-committal sound and turned to the central area where Lord Derwent's chair still remained. The body was found here, yet the air was undisturbed, the glass untouched, the door locked from within, and yet someone got in, or perhaps someone never left. Ransom stiffened. You mean he was poisoned earlier, before he entered? Or, Poirot said, someone was hidden in the conservatory already, waiting? Impossible. There's nowhere to hide. Poirot moved to the rear wall and pointed to a large garden storage cabinet, half concealed by a curtain of vines. It is large enough, and it was unlocked. Ransom's expression darkened. That cabinet's only for tools. I didn't notice. No, Poirot said gently. You did not notice, and yet it is most important. He opened the cabinet. Inside was a spade, a watering can, and 2 empty hooks. Something is missing, Poirot murmured. Ransom frowned. There should be a hand rake and a misting bottle. I used them just the other day. Poirot made a mental note. You are certain? Quite. Poirot turned slowly. Then I must ask you one final thing, Doctor. Who else had access to this room? Alistair. Myself. Lady Margaret occasionally. Edward never came in here, said the humidity aggravated his sinuses. Then I shall take a walk, Poirot said, and let the plants do some talking. Later that evening, Poirot stood beneath the stars in the back garden, examining the glass structure by lantern light. The footprint he'd seen earlier still lingered by the wall. He traced its angle to a segment of glass that had a faint smudge near the latch, nearly invisible by day, more pronounced under angled light. He stepped closer. The pane was not broken, but it bore the faintest groove, where perhaps a suction cup had been attached. And from within, the window had an internal fastening, just like the door. If it had been opened and then closed again with care, it might have gone unnoticed. Poirot straightened, a route in and out. The sealed room was not quite as sealed as it seemed. As he returned to the house, the distant clang of something metallic caught his attention. He rounded the corner to the tool shed and found the door ajar. Inside, someone had hastily shoved items into the shadows. Poirot picked them up one by one, a hand rake, a misting bottle, and tucked beside them a small canvas bag. He opened it. Inside were gloves and a folded piece of paper, botanical instructions, detailed notes on extracting plant alkaloids, some underlined, some circled. Poirot closed the bag gently and looked back toward the house. The murderer was clever, but they had underestimated the persistence of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 4. The Window That Shouldn't Open. The following morning at Greystone Hall dawned grey and sharp, the mist clinging to the yew hedges and gravel paths, like secrets reluctant to be shaken off. The conservatory glimmered behind its iron frame, dewy and pristine, as though its glass walls had not held death only days before. Hercule Poirot stood outside it now, wearing his heavy wool coat and leather gloves, examining the eastern window. The one he had studied in the moonlight the night before. He reached out, pressed gently, and the pane moved ever so slightly in its frame. Voila, he murmured. Someone had tampered with the fastening. Enough to open it silently, enough to close it again without detection. The seal had not held, not from within, but from without. The sanctity of the sealed room had been violated. As he walked back toward the house, he saw Edward Linley pacing under the portico. His gait was brisk, but tension radiated from him with every step. Poirot intercepted him just outside the breakfast room. "Monsieur Linley," he said smoothly, "might I borrow a moment of your time?" Linley blinked, startled. Of course, they sat together in the small morning room, a space filled with golden light and the distant ticking of a long case clock. "You seem troubled," Poirot said gently. Linley's jaw clenched. I am, yes. I've just been told the will is missing. Ah, Poirot said, folding his hands. So Lord Derwent had made recent changes. Apparently. His solicitor came this morning. Said Alistair wrote a new will 2 weeks ago, cutting off several distant relatives, shifting portions of the estate. But it isn't in the safe. Where is it usually kept? In the study. The old safe behind the portrait of his grandfather. And who knew the combination? Only Alistair. But he often left it unlocked during the day. Too trusting, really? Poirot's brow furrowed. And who stands to benefit most from this change? Linley hesitated. Lady Margaret, I believe, and Dr. Ransom. Alistair had begun formalizing an endowment for the conservatory. Ransom's research foundation. Curious, Poirot said softly, for a man who did not trust the doctor's methods. Linley gave a bitter laugh. Alistair was many things, unpredictable chief among them. And the missing will? Poirot pressed. Could someone have removed it after his death? Linley's eyes darkened. Or before, if they knew what it contained. Poirot spent the next hour in the study, inspecting the old safe. The lock showed no signs of forced entry, but the layer of dust on the inner shelf was faintly disturbed, as though something had been taken in haste. He ran a gloved finger across the metal, then examined the bookshelf opposite. One volume, Botanical Alchemy, Natural Compounds and Their Properties, was shelved upside down. He pulled it down. A note fluttered free. In Alistair's heavy hand, it read, If something happens to me, do not trust the obvious. The garden holds more than flowers. Poirot stared at the words. Not a confession, a warning. He slipped the note into his pocket and turned to find Lady Margaret standing in the doorway. You found something, she said quietly. I found a man who feared something, or someone. Her eyes flickered. He had grown paranoid. He thought someone was watching him. Was someone? She hesitated. He accused Ransom once, said the man had ulterior motives for staying on here. Did you believe him? I believed he was frightened, and that was unlike him. Poirot nodded. Fear, madam, is often the truest clue. Later, Poirot found Dr. Ransom in the far gardens, trimming ivy from a crumbling stone wall. You work as though nothing has changed, Poirot remarked. Ransom didn't look up. The plants continue to grow. They require care, murder, or no. Poirot stepped closer. Do you know anything of alkaloid extraction, doctor? That caught the man's attention. Of course, it's basic chemistry. And would it be difficult to manufacture a poison that leaves no immediate trace? Ransom's shears paused. Not difficult, but it would require time, access, equipment. Like the kind you keep in the laboratory beneath the conservatory. Ransom's face darkened. I hope you're not accusing me, Monsieur Poirot. Accusing? No, I am merely verifying. He reached into his coat and produced the canvas bag he had discovered. Recognize this? Ransom took it, opened it. His face remained composed. Yes, it's mine. I'd thought I left it in the shed. And the gloves? I use them for pruning. And the paper? Your notes on alkaloids? He nodded. They're from a lecture I gave last spring. Still, this doesn't prove anything. No, Poirot agreed. It does not. But it tells me where to look next. By evening, Poirot had convened the entire household in the drawing room. The air was tight with expectation, the fire casting flickering shadows on the old tapestries. Lady Margaret sat closest to the hearth, her face unreadable. Edward Lindley stood by the window, wringing his hands. Dr. Ransom leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "My friends," Poirot began, "this house has lost its master. The manner of his death was curious. Locked within a room, none could enter. But I say to you now, it was not suicide, it was murder." Gasps, then silence. Poirot continued, "And it was committed by someone who knew the house well, who knew the habits of Lord Derwent, and who used both science and misdirection to cover their tracks." He walked to the center of the room. There was an entrance into the conservatory. A window, not as secure as claimed, it was open from the outside. The killer entered, administered a dose of poison that would take time to act, and left again. Lady Margaret spoke first, but the coroner said no poison was found. Poirot turned to her. "Indeed, because it was derived from Gelsemium elegans, a rare plant not native to England, but kept here in the conservatory. The symptoms mimic natural causes, death by paralysis, and it fades from the bloodstream quickly." Ransom stiffened. "That plant is in my restricted collection. We, and only someone with your knowledge, could prepare such a compound." Ransom took a step forward. "You think I killed him for money?" "I think," Poirot said calmly, "you killed him because he planned to cut off your funding. The endowment was never finalized, and you discovered he had changed his will. So you made certain he would not be able to revoke your place at Greystone." The doctor's face reddened. "You have no proof." Poirot smiled sadly. "Ah, but I do. You see, you made one mistake. The misting bottle from your kit used to administer the poison as vapor. It contains traces of gelsamine, and it bears your fingerprints." Ransom paled. Lindley stared in horror. I knew he'd been in the conservatory that night, but I thought he was working. I didn't think." Poirot raised a hand. "It is not your guilt, monsieur. But your silence nearly protected a killer." Ransom backed toward the door, but McClintock stepped forward from the hallway, having arrived at Poirot's request. "Dr. Hugo Ransom," the inspector said firmly, "you are under arrest for the murder of Lord Alistair Derwent." As Ransom was led away, Lady Margaret rose to her feet. "Why?" she asked softly. "He had everything he wanted." Poirot looked at her gently. "No, madam. He had ambition. And ambition, when thwarted, is as dangerous as poison." Chapter 5. Secrets in the Steam. The following morning brought with it the smell of rain-soaked soil and freshly cut grass, a deceptive calm blanketing the grounds of Greystone Hall. But inside the manor, tension threaded through every corridor like creeping ivy. The arrest of Dr. Hugo Ransom the night before had shaken the household to its roots. And though Poirot's declaration seemed decisive, the detective himself was not content. In his guest chamber, Poirot sat at the writing desk, carefully reviewing the notes he had made during his investigation. Something was amiss. He had presented a solution, yes, but it had not sat well with his little gray cells. Too neat, too simple. He tapped a pen gently against his chin. Ransom's motive had been plausible. The evidence had seemed damning. But one fact clung stubbornly to his mind, refusing to be dismissed. Ransom had been surprised, genuinely surprised, not in the theatrical manner of a cornered man, but in the stunned way of someone betrayed by a truth they themselves had not grasped. Poirot rose and crossed the room, retrieving the small sealed envelope he had tucked into his valise the night before, the note he had found in the study, the one written in Alistair Derwent's own hand. He unfolded it once more. "If something happens to me, do not trust the obvious. The garden holds more than flowers. The garden, not the conservatory." He stared out the rain-flecked window toward the south lawn. Below it stretched a winding gravel path, leading into the oldest part of the estate grounds, the sunken garden. Once formal, now overgrown, it held stone statues in various states of disrepair and a crumbling fountain overtaken by moss. It also held the gardener's cottage. Poirot rang for Miss Fletcher, the maid he trusted most in the household. "Please," he said as she entered, "send for Mr. Linley. Ask him to meet me near the old garden in 15 minutes. Miss Fletcher nodded, wide-eyed, and left without question. Poirot donned his hat, tightened his coat against the drizzle, and made his way outside. Edward Linley arrived looking puzzled and weary, his coat flapping against the wind. "I thought you'd finished with us," he said. "Ah," said Poirot, "but the truth, Monsieur Linley, is rarely so accommodating." They walked together down the gravel path, wet stones crunching beneath their feet. "You mentioned," Poirot said gently, "that Alistair had been unstable lately. Was that your impression?" Linley frowned. "He'd been troubled, yes, but not mad. Distracted more like, always carrying that little notebook, sketching ideas." "And did he confide in you about anything unusual? Any suspicions?" "Not directly," Linley said slowly. "But once he said the house was keeping things from him. That people weren't what they seemed. I thought he meant Ransom." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "You were not alone in that assumption." They arrived at the gardener's cottage. It stood squat and empty, its windows dusty, its door ajar. No one had lived there for years, not since old Tom, the last gardener, had died. But something had drawn Poirot here. A hunch, a whisper of misdirection. He stepped inside, dust-coated, every surface, a rusted stove, cobwebbed tools, a broken watering can. Linley followed behind. "There's nothing here," he said, but Poirot was already moving to the fireplace. "A good place for hiding things, no?" He reached up, tapped gently at the bricks above the mantel, and found what he was looking for, a loose one. He pulled it free. Behind it was a leather-bound journal, Alistair Derwent's notebook. He opened it with care. The pages were filled with erratic handwriting, sketches of the estate, underlined names, Ransom, Margaret, even Linley himself. And on the final page, written in a steady hand, were the words, "I have made enemies of those closest to me. Margaret is not to be trusted. She fears what I know. The conservatory is only the surface. The real root is older and buried deeper. She watched me plant the key." Poirot's breath caught. "Margaret." He turned to Linley, who had gone pale. "You must not speak of this to anyone," Poirot said quietly. "Not yet." Linley nodded, silent and grim. Back at the manor, Lady Margaret was in the library, poring over estate documents with the calm precision of someone assuming command. She looked up as Poirot entered. "I hope you've come to tell me this nightmare is finished," she said coolly. "Not quite, Madame," Poirot replied, "but I believe we are close." She arched a brow. "Is that so?" Poirot stepped forward. "Tell me, Lady Margaret, what do you know of the garden beneath the east wing?" She hesitated. "Nothing really. It's been abandoned for years." "Yet, Lord Derwent wrote that you watched him plant something there, something he considered a key." She stood abruptly. "What are you implying? That you knew more than you let on? That perhaps, when he threatened to expose something, or remove you from the will, you acted?" Her composure cracked slightly. He was losing his mind. Was he? Or had he simply discovered a truth too inconvenient? She didn't respond. Poirot moved closer. "You see, Madame, I no longer believe Ransom acted alone, if he acted at all. Alistair Derwent had enemies, yes, but he also had fears, and I think he hid the truth not only in words, but in action." He placed the journal on the table. Margaret's face went pale. But Poirot held up a hand. "Not now. There is one more place I must look. Then I believe we shall have our answer." An hour later, Poirot was in the East Garden with Inspector McClintock and Edward Linley. They dug beneath the stone sundial, guided by a map Alistair had sketched in his journal. The soil was damp, resistant. Then Linley's spade struck something solid. A small metal box. McClintock opened it. Inside, the missing will, and beneath it, something else, a faded photograph. Margaret with a younger man, arm in arm. On the back, written in Alistair's hand, "The truth she never told me." McClintock whistled. "Looks like blackmail wasn't off the table after all." Poirot nodded grimly. She feared discovery, not only of her past, but of her present. Alistair knew, and when he threatened to change the will again, she panicked. He turned to Linley and Ransom, a convenient scapegoat, frightening, eccentric, but not the killer. The inspector sighed. "We'll need to speak with Lady Margaret again." That evening, as the sun set behind the ancient oaks, Poirot sat once more in the drawing room, watching the fire. His fingers tapped softly on the armrest. Linley entered with 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Poirot. "She'll be taken in tonight," he said quietly. Poirot nodded. "It is sad, mon ami, how often murder blooms from secrets planted long ago." Linley looked toward the conservatory, now silent and empty. "And the house?" he asked. "What will become of it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Perhaps it shall grow quiet again. No more ghosts, no more lies." He sipped his tea. "But you, Monsieur Linley, you must tend it carefully." Chapter 6. Shadows in the Garden. Rain had ceased by morning, leaving Greystone Hall cloaked in a shimmering mist that clung to the hedgerows and silvered every blade of grass. In the fragile light of dawn, the house seemed almost reborn. Its sharp angles softened, its long windows catching glints of reluctant sun. But inside, the tension remained. Lady Margaret Derwent had been taken quietly into custody the night before. Inspector McClintock had handled the matter with professional courtesy, allowing her dignity Even as the weight of suspicion closed around her, she had not protested, had not wept. She had merely bowed her head and gone with them, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders like a funeral shroud. Now, Greystone Hall stood in a strange suspended state, part mourning, part relief. Poirot sat in the breakfast room, a delicate cup of tisane steaming gently before him. Hastings, freshly returned from town with updates from the solicitor's office, stood by the window, peering out into the swirling mist. "She's confessed, Poirot," Hastings said at last, turning to face him, "at least in part." Poirot raised a single eyebrow. "Confessed? What, precisely?" Hastings crossed the room, unfolding a slip of paper. "She admits she discovered Alistair's plan to change the will again, to revoke her inheritance. Completely. Apparently, he intended to leave everything to a charitable trust, to maintain the estate after his death. Margaret feared she would be left with nothing." Poirot nodded slowly, fingertips pressed together. "Greed, Hastings, is a most fertile soil for murder. She insists she didn't mean for him to die," Hastings added hurriedly. "Only to frighten him, to weaken him perhaps. She and an unknown accomplice administered a compound through the misting system in the conservatory. But the dosage was too strong." Poirot frowned. "An unknown accomplice." Hastings nodded. "She refuses to name them." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Then the matter is not yet finished." He rose, smoothing his jacket carefully, and began to pace the room. "You see, Hastings, Lady Margaret is not the type to act impulsively. She planned carefully, with knowledge of the estate, the plants, the timings, but even she would require assistance. Someone with access to the grounds, to the misting system, to the laboratory below the conservatory." Hastings looked confused. "Ransom's been cleared, hasn't he?" Poirot smiled thinly. "Oui, but there are others." He retrieved his small notebook and flipped it open to a page filled with names. Lady Margaret, Edward Linley, Hugo Ransom, Mrs. Farley the housekeeper, Miss Fletcher the maid. Poirot tapped one name lightly. Edward Linley. Hastings' mouth fell open. "Linley. But he's harmless, nervous as a rabbit." Poirot shook his head. "Nah, mon ami. Nervousness can mask cunning very well. And desperation. Our desperation drives even the meek to daring acts." He crossed to the window, staring out across the Sutton Gardens. "Consider, Hastings. Linley stood to lose everything if Lady Margaret's fortunes crumbled. His own position depended upon her patronage. Her influence would protect him, secure his future. Without her, he would be adrift, exposed." Poirot turned back sharply. "And it was Linley who first suggested Alistair's mental instability. Linley who guided the solicitor to suspect a missing will. Linley who hovered at every revelation, pushing the investigation just subtly enough." Hastings shook his head slowly. "You think he helped her?" "I think," Poirot said quietly, "he did more than help. I think he planned the method." There was a knock at the door. Miss Fletcher appeared, wringing her hands nervously. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said, curtsying slightly. "Mr. Linley asked me to tell you he's awaiting you in the conservatory. He said he wished to confess something." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "The trap closes itself, mon ami. The conservatory was still warm from the sun's filtered rays, though the air smelled faintly of damp soil and something more acrid beneath. The ghosts of poisons, perhaps, or guilt left hanging in the mist. Edward Linley stood by the far fountain, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His face was pale, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. When Poirot and Hastings entered, he turned slowly, as though gathering every shred of strength he possessed. "I suppose you know," Linley said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. "I know enough. The rest, monsieur, I leave for your conscience to reveal." Linley gave a sad, broken laugh. "It was never meant to kill him. Margaret wanted to scare him, weaken him, just enough that he would reconsider. I told her about the plants. I helped her measure the dosage." He closed his eyes briefly. "But it was me who set the misting system to run overnight. I thought it would be gentle. Just make him ill, not—" He broke off, swallowing hard. Poirot stepped closer, voice low but firm. "And when he died," Linley's voice cracked, "I wanted to undo it. I tried to hide the evidence, the gloves, the misting bottle. I panicked, and when Ransom was arrested, I told myself it was fate, that perhaps justice had been served in some twisted way." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Justice, monsieur, is never served by silence." Linley sagged against the fountain's rim, defeated. "I'll confess it all," he said, to McClintock, "to the court. I'll tell them Margaret never meant for it to happen." Poirot straightened his cuffs with mechanical precision. "You will tell them everything," he said softly, "and then, perhaps, find some measure of forgiveness. If not from the world, then from yourself." The days that followed saw Greystone Hall transformed yet again. Margaret Derwent and Edward Linley were both formally charged. Conspiracy, negligence leading to death, destruction of evidence. The courts would determine their fates, but Poirot suspected justice would be tempered with pity. Theirs had been a crime born not of hatred, but of fear and weakness. And such things, while still culpable, carried a sadness the law could not erase. Hercule Poirot, his work complete, prepared to take his leave. On his final morning at Greystone Hall, he stood once more before the conservatory, now cleaned, the glass mended, the plants tended carefully by new hands. The garden no longer whispered of secrets. It simply lived. Hastings joined him by the drive, bags packed in the car. "Another mystery solved, eh, Poirot?" he said, clapping his friend lightly on the back. Poirot smiled, though his eyes were thoughtful. "Oui, mon ami. Another page closed, but remember, even the most beautiful garden may hide the deepest roots of tragedy." He cast one last look back at Greystone Hall, its stone walls gleaming, its glass rooms sparkling like a jewel, and then stepped into the car. As they drove away, the mist curled behind them once more, swallowing the house from sight. But not from memory, never from memory. Chapter 7. The Garden That Remembered Winter. Descended early upon Yorkshire that year. By December, a brittle frost coated the moors, and the trees surrounding Greystone Hall stood black and skeletal against the low pewter sky. The great house itself seemed to huddle into its stone shoulders, cloaked in an icy silence. But inside the walls of the estate, a different kind of change had taken root. The scandal of Lord Alistair Derwent's death, Lady Margaret's arrest, and Edward Linley's confession had rippled through the village of Greystone and beyond. Yet, remarkably, Greystone Hall endured. It had, after all, survived worse across its long weathered history. Ownership of the estate now lay with a charitable trust, a group of trustees assembled to preserve the house and its grounds as a living monument. Visitors would eventually be permitted, tours given, the grand halls and the famed conservatory shown to those who sought a glimpse into the past. But for now, it remained still, healing, and Hercule Poirot, seated comfortably by the fireplace of his London flat, allowed himself a small, rare moment of reflection. The case had disturbed him more deeply than he cared to admit. There had been no monstrous villain at Greystone Hall, no cold-blooded killer with a gleaming knife or a cunning plot of revenge. Only people, flawed, frightened, desperate people, grasping in the dark to preserve what they loved or feared losing. And in that struggle, tragedy had bloomed, as it always did. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Hastings entered carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Post for you, Poirot," he said, setting it carefully on the table. Poirot regarded the package curiously. It bore no return address, but the handwriting was familiar, elegant, old-fashioned. Lady Margaret's hand. Poirot unwrapped it gently. Inside was a thin, leather-bound volume, a journal. Tucked inside its front cover was a single sheet of paper. "Monsieur Poirot, by now, the world knows my guilt. I do not seek forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But before my fate is sealed by the law, I wished to send you this. This journal belonged to Alistair. It is his record of Greystone Hall, not of the scandals, but of the garden, the plants he loved, the histories he cherished. He was many things, but he loved this place with all his flawed heart. Perhaps you will understand better than most why it was so hard for us to let it all go. Yours in sorrow, Lady Margaret Derwent." Poirot turned the pages slowly. There were sketches of orchids and rare ferns, lists of seed imports, notes on temperature and irrigation. But woven between the careful botanical observations were glimpses of a man's heart. The house remembers. The garden listens. Every footstep, every sorrow. It blooms with memory as much as with life. Poirot closed the book with great care, his heart heavy but peaceful. The house had remembered, the garden had listened, and though tragedy had marked it once more, the living memory of Greystone Hall would endure. Weeks later, Poirot found himself once again upon the gravel paths of Greystone. The trustees had extended him a private invitation to visit before the estate reopened to the public. Hastings had accompanied him, though grumbling about the cold. "I don't see why we couldn't have waited until spring," Hastings muttered, adjusting his scarf as they approached the main entrance. Poirot only smiled, because, mon ami, memory does not wait for the seasons, and neither does truth. They were greeted by Miss Fletcher, the loyal maid who had remained to assist in the house's transition. She had aged in the short months since Poirot had last seen her, but there was a lightness about her too, as if the burdens once hidden in the house had lifted. "Monsieur Poirot," she said warmly, "We're honored you've returned." She led them through the halls. Some rooms remained shrouded in dust sheets, but others had been restored. Sunlight poured in through polished windows, and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and lavender instead of damp and sorrow. When they reached the conservatory, Poirot paused at the threshold. It had changed little. The glass walls gleamed, the great iron ribs arching upward like the bones of some fantastic creature. Within, the plants thrived. The orchids, the ferns, even the shy heliotropes lifting their faces to the winter sun. But it was the plaque that caught Poirot's attention. Affixed discreetly to the wall by the entrance, it read, "The Garden Remembers, dedicated to Lord Alistair Derwent, and all who loved Greystone Hall, in memory and peace." Poirot's throat tightened unexpectedly. Hastings, reading over his shoulder, cleared his throat gruffly. "Quite right," he said. "They've done a good thing." Poirot nodded. A very good thing." He stepped inside, breathing in the moist, earthy air. He imagined for a moment the echoes of the past, the whispered arguments, the fearful secrets, the desperate hopes, but they no longer weighed down the room. They were simply part of it, folded into the roots and leaves, into the light filtering through the glass. Poirot moved slowly to the center of the conservatory, to the spot where Lord Derwent had sat in his final moments. There was no trace of tragedy now. Only a chair, tucked beside a small marble fountain, surrounded by life. Poirot bowed his head. "Rest, mon ami," he murmured under his breath. "Your house remembers you. Your garden remembers you, and so shall I." Later, as they prepared to depart, Miss Fletcher handed Poirot a small envelope. "One last thing, sir," she said. "It was found among Lady Margaret's effects. She left instructions for it to be given to you." Poirot opened it once he was seated comfortably in the motor car. Inside was a single pressed violet, faded but intact, and, beneath it, a line of writing. "Some things must be buried to grow. Some truths must be unearthed to heal." Poirot closed the envelope and tucked it carefully into his pocket. As Hastings started the engine, and the great house disappeared once more into the mist behind them, Poirot leaned back, eyes half closed. The garden had remembered, and in its quiet endurance, it had taught them all the most important lesson of all, that no secret, however deeply buried, could remain hidden forever. But with truth and with remembrance, even the deepest wounds could heal, and life, stubborn, beautiful life, would always find a way to bloom again. Chapter 8. A Final Bloom. The first real snow of the season fell 2 weeks later, blanketing the Yorkshire moors in just a quilt of white so pure it seemed to hush even the murmurs of the ever-restless wind. At Greystone Hall, the world outside the great windows transformed into a still silvered landscape, where time itself seemed to have paused. Inside, preparations for the estate's limited reopening were nearing completion. The trustees had decided to dedicate a portion of the manor to a permanent exhibition, "The Gardens of Greystone," chronicling Lord Derwent's botanical passions and the history of the house itself. A quiet, thoughtful tribute, neither a shrine to scandal nor an erasure of it, but something honest, something enduring. Hercule Poirot received a formal invitation to the inaugural gathering, a simple card embossed with ivy leaves. Monsieur Poirot, you are cordially invited to attend the private opening of Greystone Hall's Conservatory Memorial. Memory is not the enemy of peace, but its beginning. With deepest gratitude, the trustees of Greystone Hall. Poirot smiled when he read it. He tapped the card lightly against his chin, considering. Hastings, lounging nearby with a newspaper, noticed the gleam in his friend's eye. "You're going to accept, aren't you?" Hastings said knowingly. "Mais naturellement," Poirot replied. "It would be most improper not to pay one's respects when memory blooms anew." The day of the opening was clear and sharp, the sun catching in quiescent the drifts of snow until the entire landscape glittered. Greystone Hall looked splendid, the stonework newly cleaned, the ivy trimmed but respectfully left to snake around the ancient buttresses. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued but not somber. Locals and a few invited guests wandered the halls, admiring portraits newly restored, tapestries brushed free of dust. Poirot and Hastings moved among them, polite and observant. In the grand ballroom, where the refreshments were served, the yacht conversation swirled, whispers of the past tragedy certainly, but also admiration for the estate's renewal. Poirot listened, but he was not distracted. His eyes were always moving, because he sensed it. A final thread yet untied. A final truth yet unspoken. And he trusted his little gray cells implicitly. At noon, the guests were gathered in the conservatory for the formal dedication. Missy Fletcher, looking proud and a little nervous, led the ceremony. She spoke simply of Lord Derwent's love for rare plants, his dream of bringing a piece of distant jungles to the English countryside, and of the house's long history of endurance. At the end, she gestured toward a new display, tucked into one corner of the conservatory. A glass case, standing on a polished mahogany pedestal. Inside was a simple exhibit. Lord Derwent's original journal, now carefully preserved and open to the page where he had written, "The house remembers. The garden listens." Beside it lay the pressed violet Lady Margaret had once sent to Poirot, a small plaque read, "In remembrance of those who loved, those who erred, and those who endured." A hush settled over the gathered crowd. Poirot, standing slightly apart, felt a tightness in his chest. Not grief, not exactly. Something finer, a bittersweet kind of peace. The applause that followed was muted, but heartfelt. As the crowd dispersed into smaller groups, Poirot remained behind, staring thoughtfully at the glass case. It was Hastings who interrupted his reverie. "Well, Poirot," he said softly, "you've done it again. Brought truth into the light." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Non, mon ami. I merely followed the footsteps left by those who could no longer walk themselves." He turned from the case and moved toward the far end of the conservatory, where a small iron gate led out into the east garden. And it was there, standing alone by the frosted hedgerows, that Poirot found her, Miss Fletcher. She was staring at the snow-covered sundial, the very place where the final secrets had been unearthed months ago. Poirot approached quietly. "You have worked hard, mademoiselle," he said gently. She turned startled. Then, seeing it was him, she offered a sad smile. "I had to. For them. For all of them." Poirot studied her carefully. "And for yourself?" She looked away. "Perhaps." Poirot tucked his gloved hands behind his back. "You know," he said softly, "there is something that has long puzzled me." Miss Fletcher frowned slightly. "It was you," Poirot said, "who found the loose floorboard in the conservatory first, was it not? Months ago, you knew of the hidden vent." She said nothing. "And it was you who encouraged Lady Margaret to act, gently, subtly, a word here, a hint there, enough to steer her, without ever appearing to do so." Still she said nothing. Poirot's voice dropped. "You loved Lord Derwent." At last, Miss Fletcher met his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "I loved him. More than Margaret ever did. She loved what he could give her. I loved who he was before he let power and pride ruin him." Poirot nodded slowly, his heart heavy. "You helped her," he said. "You thought you could frighten him, force him to change, to humble himself. But you underestimated the poison. You underestimated the consequences." Tears welled in Miss Fletcher's eyes, glinting in the weak winter sun. "I didn't mean for him to die," she said fiercely. "I just wanted him to see, to remember who he had been." Poirot sighed softly. "Ah, mademoiselle, the past is a garden with thorns as well as flowers." They stood together in silence, the snow swirling around them. Finally, Poirot spoke. "You will not be punished by the law. There is no proof that ties you to the crime directly. Lady Margaret and Edward Linley have taken the blame. But your conscience, mademoiselle, that is punishment enough." She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Poirot bowed his head slightly, offering the dignity of a final mercy. "May you find peace," he said quietly, "and may Greystone Hall bloom again." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked back toward the house. Behind him, the sundial stood like a silent witness to all that had passed. As Poirot and Hastings drove away later that afternoon, the sky cleared, and a pale sun broke through the clouds. The snow glittered on the fields, untouched and beautiful. Hastings steered the car carefully along the narrow road. "Do you think she'll find peace, Poirot?" Poirot stared out the window, thoughtful. "Perhaps, in time." He tapped a finger lightly against his knee. "But memory, Hastings, it is not so easily silenced. Greystone Hall will remember, the garden will remember, and so must we." The road wound onward, the house vanishing behind them into the gathering dusk. But in Poirot's heart, and in the soil of Greystone itself, the truth remained. A final bloom, a final remembrance, a final peace. Chapter 9. The Last Violet. The train, from Yorkshire to London, cut through the white fields like a silver needle, stitching together two worlds. One of silence, one of noise, one of memory, one of the endless rush of the present. Inside his private carriage, Hercule Poirot sat alone, a small leather valise at his side, and a heavy wool coat folded neatly on the seat beside him. He had said his farewells at Greystone Hall without ceremony. Hastings had already returned to London the day before on urgent personal business, leaving Poirot the luxury of solitude. He preferred it that way today. The events at Greystone had left an impression on him, a lingering weight not of unfinished business but of a deeper melancholy. He had solved many crimes in his life. He had seen men and women kill for greed, for love, for fear. but rarely had a case left behind such a complicated sorrow. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothed a wrinkle from his trousers, and retrieved from his coat pocket a small object, the envelope Miss Fletcher had given him. Inside it, carefully preserved, was the single pressed violet Lady Margaret had sent him months before. He placed it gently on the small table by the window, and gazed at it, his reflection blurred in the rain-flecked glass. A violet. Simple. Fragile. Defiant against the cold, just like memory. Poirot leaned back, folding his hands across his middle, his little gray cells, usually so quick to leap from case to case, now lingered, turning the events of Greystone Hall over and over in a final, silent review. Lady Margaret, Edward Linley, Miss Fletcher, even poor Lord Derwent himself, all had been prisoners of their own fears, fear of losing status, fear of exposure, fear of being forgotten. And fear, Poirot knew, was the most insidious poison of all. It clouded judgment, distorted loyalties, and twisted love into something brittle and dangerous. He sighed softly. To love without fear, he thought, is perhaps the greatest courage of all. The train rocked gently over the tracks, the rhythmic clatter lulling him into a reverie. In London, the city was a blur of grey mist and red omnibuses when Poirot arrived. At his flat, his manservant George greeted him at the door with his usual brisk efficiency, taking his coat and hat without a word. Poirot ascended the stairs slowly, savoring the familiar creaks of the wood, the soft ticking of the hall clock, the distant hum of the city beyond his windows. He entered his sitting room, paused, and allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The perfectly aligned chairs, the shining glass of the coffee table, the immaculate placement of his beloved ornaments. Order restored, chaos held at bay. He moved to the writing desk by the window and placed the pressed violet there, setting a small glass paperweight atop it to protect it from the draught. Then he sat, withdrew a fresh sheet of thick cream stationery, and began to write. To the trustees of Greystone Hall, may I humbly suggest the addition of a final plaque to your conservatory, a simple dedication, in remembrance of all things fragile yet enduring. As the violet blooms in the frost, so too does memory flourish in the heart. Yours in respect, Hercule Poirot. He signed the letter with a flourish, blotted it carefully, and set it aside to post the next morning. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he opened the small leather valise he had carried back from Yorkshire. Inside were his notes from the case at Greystone. Observations, sketches, timelines, interviews. The tangible map of how he had unraveled the mystery. Poirot leafed through them thoughtfully. He paused at a page where he had written a single line months ago, during the first days of his investigation. The house remembers, the garden listens. He tapped his pen lightly against the words. In the end, it had not been Poirot alone who had uncovered the truth. Greystone Hall itself had spoken, through locked doors and cracked windows, through dead flowers and forgotten journals, through the sorrow of those who remained. The house had demanded to be heard. Poirot smiled gently, feeling no triumph, only quiet satisfaction. He closed the notebook, secured it with a ribbon, and placed it carefully in his archive drawer. The one reserved not for triumphs of deduction, but for cases that had touched the heart more than the mind. It would sit there alongside a few other cases, rare ones, where justice had not meant punishment alone, but understanding, forgiveness, healing. Poirot rose and crossed to the fireplace, where a low fire burned in the grate. He stood there for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, watching the flames dance and snap. In the end, he thought, memory was not a burden. It was a garden, messy, tangled, full of old roots and stubborn weeds, but also bursting with life and color and fragile, persistent hope. A final bloom, even in the frost. He smiled faintly, turned down the lamps, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring another case, another challenge. But tonight, he allowed himself to rest. And somewhere, far away across the misty moors, Greystone Hall slept too, its secrets laid to rest, its gardens whispering softly. Mew in the winter wind, the house remembered, and so would he. Always. Chapter 10. The Enduring Garden. The weeks after Poirot's return to London unfold in a blur of grey skies, sharp winds, and a steady, relentless rain that painted the city in a watercolor of shifting reflections. The events of Greystone Hall receded into the background of public chatter. Briefly sensational, then quietly absorbed into the endless hum of scandal, society, and shifting fortunes. But for Hercule Poirot, they did not fade. He carried them within him, not as a burden, but as a quiet presence, like the scent of violets clinging to a winter coat, long after the flowers themselves were gone. It was on one such rainy afternoon that Poirot, seated in his immaculate armchair, turned once again to the small leather journal sent by Lady Margaret. He read it slowly, page by page, allowing the personality of Lord Derwent to unfold anew, not as a victim, but as a man, flawed, proud, and deeply human. When he finished, he closed the book gently, and sat for a long moment, in thoughtful silence. The house had remembered, the garden had listened, but it was memory, living, stubborn memory, that endured. Several days later, Poirot accepted an invitation to lunch from Hastings at a quiet cafe off Piccadilly. The rain had abated for once, leaving behind slick cobblestones and glistening shop windows. They ate together by a window, watching the city bustle past, their conversation light at first, news of acquaintances, small gossip. Hastings half-formed plans to holiday in Devon. But inevitably, as the coffee arrived, their talk drifted back to Greystone. "You know," Hastings said, stirring sugar into his cup, "I've been thinking about it, about Miss Fletcher, about how easily things could have gone differently." Poirot nodded slowly. A tragedy of small choices, 1,000 tiny missteps that led inexorably to disaster. Hastings leaned back in his chair. "Do you think she'll ever be at peace?" Poirot sipped his coffee before answering. "Peace, Hastings, is not a gift. It is a cultivation. It must be tended, like a garden. Some wounds heal, some simply become part of the landscape." He smiled faintly, "But even a scarred garden can bloom again." Hastings watched him thoughtfully for a moment, then smiled as well. "You're getting philosophical in your old age, Poirot." Poirot chuckled softly. "Age, mon ami, brings many things. Among them, the understanding that the solving of mysteries is not the end. It is only ever the beginning." That evening, back in his flat, Poirot made a decision. He opened his archive drawer once more, and retrieved not the Greystone case file, but the pressed violet still resting beneath its glass paperweight. He placed it carefully in a small wooden frame, a simple thing, no ornamentation, no gilding, just wood and glass, clean and unadorned. Then he hung it above the desk where he conducted his daily work. The countless letters, the tangled cases, the endless puzzles that made up the rhythm of his life, a small thing, but meaningful. He did not label it. He did not need to. The violet spoke for itself. It was a reminder that every case, every mystery, was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a story of lives touched, futures altered, memories preserved or lost. And it reminded him, too, that justice was not always thunderous and grand. Sometimes it was small, quiet, like a flower pressing up stubbornly through frost. Months passed. The snow melted from the moors. Spring came hesitantly to Yorkshire, and with it, the first crocuses pushing bravely through the thawing ground. At Greystone Hall, the trustees opened the estate for its first official public tour. The house was immaculate. The conservatory shone like a jewel, and in one corner of the exhibition, visitors paused before a modest plaque, reading words that stirred something they could not quite name. "The garden remembers." It became a tradition. Locals bringing violets to leave discreetly at the base of the conservatory walls, a quiet growing tribute to memory, loss, and hope. The scandal faded. The tragedy softened into history. But the garden endured. Poirot never returned to Greystone Hall. He had no need to. In his heart, he carried it with him. The misty gardens, the whisper of leaves against glass, the lingering sorrow, the quiet forgiveness. He carried it into every case thereafter, into every interview with a frightened suspect, every careful cross-examination of motive and opportunity. He carried it when he sat alone in the evenings, tidying his cufflinks and straightening his mustache, thinking not of crimes, but of human frailty and human resilience. And always, when he glanced up from his desk, he saw the violet, the last gift of a house that had once locked its doors against the world, the last bloom of a garden that had refused to be silenced. Years later, long after the names of Lady Margaret Derwent and Edward Linley were forgotten by the society pages, long after Greystone Hall had settled into the quiet dignity of a heritage estate, a young journalist interviewed Hercule Poirot for a retrospective on his career. At the end of the conversation, the journalist, curious, asked, "Of all your cases, Monsieur Poirot, is there one you remember most fondly?" Poirot smiled, an expression touched with sadness, but also great tenderness. "There was a house," he said, "of stone and glass, a house that whispered of loss and hope, a house where a garden bloomed even amid sorrow." He tapped a finger lightly against the small framed violet still hanging above his desk. "It taught me," he said softly, "that truth is not always enough. Sometimes remembrance is what matters most. The journalist, puzzled, asked for more details. But Poirot only smiled, shook his head gently, and said, "Non, mon ami. Some stories are not for the newspapers. Some are for the heart alone." And he rose, offered his hand politely, and saw the young man out. When the door closed, Poirot turned once more to the violet. The garden had remembered, and so would he, always, until the end.